This podcast is brought to you by Flex 7 from TenCate Protective Fabrics. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology. Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tencatefabrics.com/Flex 7.
In the world of firefighting and public safety, reliability is key. That's why for over 2 decades, first responders nationwide have trusted the FireStore as their go-to source for essential equipment, apparel, and accessories. Visit thefirestore.com online or in-store today.
For all your medication and narcotic tracking needs, check out the LogRX app, created by career fire and EMS professionals. That's LogRX.com.
Welcome back to Main Street Firefighting, a podcast by Fire Engineering. My name is Shady, and with me is my partner, Chris Tobin. Before we get started, we'd again like to thank Fire Engineering for the opportunity and you all for tuning in. This last week, we had a local town had a pretty devastating Main Street fire right in the middle of their main street. This town is 100% a tourist town, very well known in Missouri. And that could be devastating to their town. That could significantly impact the vitality of the town for the next, decade. And so it really reminded us of some key points that we want to talk about with these Main Street buildings and really want to rehash with listeners kind of why we stress the importance of these. So that's kind of what this is about tonight. And we hope you enjoy this discussion. So tonight, we're going to talk about kind of rehash why we do this Main Street podcast for a couple reasons. One, we've done this for a few years now, had a lot of really great conversations with some really smart people about buildings. But we just kind of want to remind listeners like why we find this to be an important topic to talk about. And we were also ourselves reminded because a town local to us, about 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes away, that we are familiar with. It's a small tourist town in Missouri that basically its only existence is for tourism. Had a pretty big Main Street fire just yesterday, and they lost a building in the middle of their main street. The fire department held it to that one building, but there's still going to be a missing piece in the middle of their main street now. And it was just kind of a good reminder for us as like a local thing of why we talk about these buildings and why we think these fires are so important for everyone, not just the urban fire department, but the small volunteer department to focus on as well.
So like Lex was saying, the big takeaway from the fire that we just had locally here was a couple things. The biggest thing that stood out to me was the amount of resources that was required. I believe it was over 13 fire departments responded to essentially what was a single storefront of fire, one building, multiple businesses, because there was an upstairs Airbnb residential component and a downstairs commercial, but it was essentially just one business, and it took 13 agencies responding, mutual aid and automatic aid, to hold that fire. Luckily, to that one business, and it didn't extend down the line and be more of a loss to that town. That was the first thing that really struck out was the just the amount of resources that are required for just a run of the mill fire in one of these main street settings. This was a 2-story, not a 3 or a 4-story buildings that does exist. It's very common in American main streets. So obviously, the taller the building, the more resources are required, and the other thing that stuck out to me at this fire is the fact that a lot of places they I think they fall into they get comfortable with the fact that they have main streets that they haven't had incidents on in a very long time. And we go to town after town after town with building construction classes and these main street classes, and every single one of these towns that we go to, big or small, they have all had memorable recent fires on their main streets. But I think a lot of places just kind of get into this mindset that it's not going to happen in this town, and they it's easy to kind of get complacent in that sort of setting when the majority of your fires aren't on Main Street or they are far and few between, it's very easy to kind of just write Main Street off or just get comfortable with the fact that you've had a very long stretch. And some of these stretches, I believe this town went probably more than a decade, if not 2 decades, without a substantial fire that I can remember on this in their main street, and then all of a sudden they get hit with one. So once again, it's something that's easy to let yourself get too complacent with. But these towns that we go to, we tell them, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and you're gonna have to be ready for the fires when they happen. But it's kind of hard to convince a town with 500 to 1,000 people that their 12 little brick buildings, that to pay attention to those when it was one day one of those is going to be on fire. Um, so when the fires they do go to, it just doesn't represent that that setting, and then all of a sudden it's on fire.
And that's not to say that this department, wasn't prepared to fight these fires. We haven't gotten the chance to speak to anybody there yet. We've talked to some people whose department went, but were not there themselves. And we've seen some photos, but again, this is just a reminder of an kind of an in general attitude that we've seen and heard come up in discussions. And I really do think that if they weren't somewhat prepared for these buildings, they would have lost a lot more than the one business they had.
So that brings up a good point. Is these buildings are in urban. This is an urban fire problem in a rural setting. So that means an urban set of rules apply, urban tactics apply here, and that's where a lot of these departments kind of get caught off kilter. They're in their own, they're out of their comfort zone, and that's really one of the big messages we do when we do these classes is that these are the build, especially if they're not dilapidated or neglected buildings. These are the ones you can really go in and get. These are the ones where you don't have to worry about the gusset plates. You don't have to worry about the lightweight construction. You don't have to worry about that kind of stuff that you would have to do with probably the majority of that agency's other fires in a lot of places. These are the buildings you have more time to go in and fight these fires from a traditional kind of template and standard, and the more traditional rules apply to these buildings. And that is just something that a lot of these smaller departments, especially in the Midwest, they just haven't honed the skills on, or they're just not used to using the plays in that particular playbook, when 9 out of the last 10 fires they have had are in either a lightweight modern construction or some um, just not a legacy type 3 building. So we always like to say, like, this is definitely the time to fight fire like fire is meant to be fought. And that's doing some things that some places might not get to do quite often, which is, heavy roof operations. I mean, heavy meaning you're not just getting up and getting down. You're actually putting people up on a flat roof, numerous roof crews, numerous saws going. It's not just a little 4x4 louver cut and get down. It's flat roofs a little more than that. Flat roofs with, you know, connected row of businesses is something more than just your ifs to book 4x4, you know, roof hole. So all those things are unfamiliar territory in a lot of these places that we go and do these classes in, which is totally to be expected. Like I said, these fires are far and few between. So, but one thing that sticks out, I would say, like the one thing that sticks out as far as like the deficit goes at these fires, for places that don't routinely run fires in these buildings, are definitely the roof ops. And that is not that is not something that you kind of figure out the deficit when you get on scene that day. That's something you have to really be proactive about. What kind of saw blades you're running, what kind of saws you're running, what are your crews going to look like that you send up there? How are they getting up there? Is it an aerial? Is it ground ladders? All that kind of stuff needs to be figured out before all of a sudden you have a fire running a cockloft in your row of, you know, historic buildings on your main street. That's not the time to sit there and think like you're just going to put together a good plan for vertical ventilation on that. Um, and of course, the only other option to that, if you have a weak roof game, you gotta have a strong overhaul game from below. And if that's another thing too, if you don't have the right pike poles, the roof hooks, the right equipment to get under it and to do that. Um, that just once again plays into a bad ending on these fires that just seem to unfortunately turn into an outside defensive stance, when a lot of times they have a very wide window of opportunity to do an offensive approach to these fires. It's just the department that shows up is just so far out of their comfort zone that they default to a defensive mode way too early. Um, which, that's not saying that's necessarily the wrong thing to do. Um, maybe that's just the honest thing to do. I'm not there to judge anyone on that, but the whole point of our class is to kind of focus on what you can get done and to really facilitate a higher performance of these departments that go to these fires on a rare occasion.
And a lot of it's simply just a reminder of how the building's made and the structural integrity of it versus the newer buildings that we see. So, everybody's heard this before, but we spend a lot of time, especially with newer recruits, talking about modern or lightweight buildings, especially with the newer things that we're seeing built as far as high rises and apartment complexes coming in to these smaller towns, condos. So we spend a lot of time talking about those, or in our small towns when those come in, we make sure that we walk those buildings so that we know how they're built and put together. But then we tend to forget about grandma's corner store that's been there for 100 years, right? We don't take the time to walk that building and really look how it's put together because we go get coffee there, every Monday of the week. And so that's kind of the other big thing we remind people with these is that you have to actually look at the building. So we see them all the time, but we're not really understanding what we're seeing. And that's the whole goal, is to kind of break this stuff down. So throughout all these podcasts that we do, when we bring people on to talk about certain topics with these buildings, that's our really goal, is to kind of break down and be able to kind of give as best as we can kind of an X-ray vision of these buildings so that we can kind of predict what the fire is going to do when we do have one.
Another pattern that we started to notice too, once we started really researching these buildings, um, is the lack of multiple lines stretched early on. Meaning, a lot of departments show up and they just have a one line mindset, and if they can't do anything with that one line, then it transitions to a defensive stance. When in reality, these these buildings are set up for a two or a three line from the default kind of approach and attack. Like I say, if you pick any Main Street taxpayer and put it down in the middle of a city anywhere in this country, the first thing company's going to show up, and by the time the truck company and the second engine, you're going to have two lines off. You're just going to have the first line's going to the floor of, and then the second line is either going to back up that line or it's going to go to the floor above for extension. And you're going to start holding stairs, protecting interior exposures. That is just something that seems to be not not done by default. Um, I don't know the one particular reason or why it is, but it's just something that the second line needs to be more emphasized on these fires, especially in these rural communities, because it seems like it's either 1 inch and 3/4, and the only other option after that is just a 2.5, or it's just a 2.5 from the get-go, which is fine. If you want to pull a big line from the get-go on a taxpayer fire, that more power to you. Especially if it's a first floor fire, usually those are more wide open spaces and not cut up. Just depends what kind of business that is. But if you can get a big line and you can get you can get it to move and go places like 1 inch and 3/4, then that's fantastic. Most places can't do that. That's a very laborious operation to put a 2.5 inch in the service like that, especially if you have to go to the second floor on these, because the stairs are typically going to be some half of the building or in the rear of the building. So that's gonna be a pretty hard it's gonna be a pretty hard stretch with a charge 2.5 to go through the building and then back up the stairs, then to make that 90 degree or the 180. So we always like to emphasize the fact that if you pull up on a Main Street fire and you have a working fire in any of these buildings, it's two lines off from the get-go as soon as possible. So that's obviously going to take at least four members for manpower wise. I don't know who's pumping the truck, and that's another thing to figure out. But we start creeping into the why I don't have the manpower for the two lines. And then I get it. Everyone's constrained on the manpower these days. But just keep in mind that second line has to come off sooner than later. That should be your next to go to on the to-do list sooner than later. It just seems like the second line gets kind of forgotten or other things occur before that happens when in reality, if that second line would have come off sooner and maybe someone wouldn't have been messing around with water supply issues or something like that, and the fire is now a lot smaller, and then now you don't have to worry about those things. The fire gets put out quicker.
Couple things kind of based off what he said. One, for those who are new listening, or maybe from kind of the East Coast area, just as a reminder, when we say taxpayers, we are talking commercial on the first floor, residential, whether it's like Airbnb or apartment styles above. So clarification for that. Another thing that we kind of talk about that's a little bit abnormal for these buildings, when he talks about multiple lines, this is kind of one of the cases where your second line may not necessarily be the same size or larger. So when you think about these buildings, the commercial on the first floor, generally kind of an open area, large open space, so easy, super easy to deploy a 2.5 line. But then when you think about the upstairs, you're talking about going up a set of stairs and then you're into apartments or living spaces. So not nearly as easy to maneuver a 2.5. So there's nothing wrong with deploying the 2.5 to the first floor and then that second line going upstairs looking for a fire extension or any fire on that second floor being that 1 3/4 line. It seems a little backwards kind of from the stuff we hear from the textbooks, but in this case, that might be the appropriate tactical choice.
So yeah, that's definitely something that is it's flip-flopped from like what you've seen traditional, the second line is always the same size or larger. But it could also, we have seen quite a few, especially in the old lodges on Main Street. The old fraternal orders always had like lodges. You got the Elks, you have the Oddfellows. Um, they had second floor lodges, so that one might be flipped to where the 2.5 would be going to the upper floor because that's the wide open space. You might have a lot of there's second and third floor dance halls we've come across in these main streets. So the first floor might be cut up, or there might be just be merchandise, might be like a antique shop or something where there's a lot of clutter in the way, and that would just eat up your hose stream. And then the second floor or the third floor might actually be the wide open, nothing, nothing blocking, no obstructions, just columns for where you would maybe then deploy a 2.5. But you just don't know. I mean, well, you do know if you pre-plan the buildings. So just something to think about. The lines might flip flop. It could be, the first line off might be a big line, the second line off might be a small line. It just depends on what's going on with these buildings. Once again, something kind of unique to fighting fire in Main Street and taxpayers. Some of the traditional rules kind of get bent with when you approach these buildings. Another big pattern that we've picked out also is the majority of the time, meaning 9 out of 10 fires in these buildings are in the rear of the building. And if you think about it, that starts to make a lot of sense because that's where all the human behavior, the fire starting behavior, fire hazard behavior is kind of conducted, right? You have the smoking areas in the back, you have the cooking, the grilling, you have cars back there, you have utilities back there, all things that pose a fire hazard of some sort. The kitchens, um, just the stuff that's going on in the rear of these buildings generally have some sort of higher fire risk than what's going on in the front. If you think about the front of these buildings, it's generally showcasing, it's just large windows and merchandise that doesn't inherently cause fires. So if you do have a fire on the first floor in the front of a business, that's something I would immediately call an investigator for. Um, and that's generally not where we see these fires at. So that's good to know. Once you pull up on one of these and you have heavy smoke coming out of the front of one of these places, immediately deploy an asset to the rear of the building. Try to get eyes on the rear of these buildings as soon as possible because that more than likely is going to be where the fire is located, just judging by all the research we've done on these fires. Majority of the time, the fire is in the rear. So before you go stretching a line through a who knows what kind of layout through an IDLH environment to go try to find a fire 60 feet deep into this building, when if you go around back, there's a rear entrance and the fire is right there. Um, So just something to kind of think about. 360s are kind of hard to get on these buildings, but essentially they're like rows. Everyone knows the challenge with a 360 on a row home or a commercial row occupancy. But to have that second engine, or even if you know the building well, that first engine can report to the rear. Um, we have had that happen at one fire. They specifically pre-planned this part of town. The fire was at that address, and they knew to respond to the rear if they had a fire at that address, and it wound up working out for them.
So kind of closing this out tonight, kind of segueing into what we're planning on talking about next month. Cold storage warehouses. They are obviously everyone knows the most famous fire for them, but they're across the country. You will still find these warehouses to some scale, even in some smaller towns. Whether or not they've burned down by now, you probably have someone in your department that knows of them. A lot of people have probably seen the one that happened in St. Louis over the summer. They dealt with multiple times before they finally knocked it down. And that kind of reminded us to start looking into these again because the St. Louis area still has some, and they do pose quite a problem for firefighting tactics, especially the limited access that you have. So that started us kind of digging into the research for these more, how these buildings are made, what exactly is in them, what the cork's like. And so we're going to bring somebody in next month to kind of have a discussion on their experiences, what we've seen with these buildings, and really hit on the construction of these because something we found is that they were built a little differently than even kind of we initially thought before studying. So we're really excited to talk about that. This was just like we said, we felt like we've been doing this long enough, and we had a really good reminder locally of kind of the importance of these Main Street fires. We just kind of wanted to refresh everybody's minds of why we want to talk about them and hopefully encourage you to once again get out in your streets and pay attention to these buildings and kind of look at them with a totally different viewpoint. Thanks again for listening to another episode of Main Street Firefighting, a podcast by Fire Engineering. We hope it was worth your time. As always, if there's a topic you'd like to learn more on or a Main Street fire you'd like to discuss, please reach out. And be sure to tune in next month for what we hope to be a really productive discussion on cold storage warehouses. Until then, have a good night.
This podcast is brought to you by Flex 7 from TenCate Protective Fabrics. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology. Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tencatefabrics.com/Flex 7.
In the world of firefighting and public safety, reliability is key. That's why for over 2 decades, first responders nationwide have trusted the TheFireStore as their go-to source for essential equipment, apparel, and accessories. Visit TheFireStore.com online or in-store today.
For all your medication and narcotic tracking needs, check out the LogRX app, created by career fire and EMS professionals. That's LogRX.com.